So we've just had another very controversial round of elections 6 months ago, just like we've had over the past 20 years. This cycle, yama controversial elections every 5 years, yatuva sort of ingrained in our culture, so it's not going to break very easily. Even in the next elections, when 2028, chances are the same thing is going to happen. So Twitter say, because if we are always going to have controversial elections, then it means we are always going to have mass sanctions. So in this video, what I want to do is to suggest an alternative to elections that I'm hoping both ZANU and opposition parties may agree to. Because as long as the sanctions are repo, the economy is only going to get worse. And as the economy gets worse, so does the politics. The politics just gets uglier and uglier. Right now, it's CCC turning against each other, but no political party is immune to economic ruin. As the economy gets worse, even ZANU, you're going to start seeing a lot of drama. Right now, as I record this, there's been a bomb scare to Vic Falls Airport, where President Mnangagwa was destined to land. His plane has been redirected, and social media is claiming tensions are high ku army. Kune vakatodzingwa mabasa, and ZANU factionalism is getting worse. Economy and politics strong enderana, so one gets worse, the other gets worse. And nyango vachinetsa nawo mapolitician, at least vane mari dzavo. For the rest of us ordinary Zimbabweans, things are getting worse and worse. Already since the elections, the currency in Zim has lost over half its value. The currency right now is in free fall, and as the currency gets weaker and inflation gets worse, eventually you're going to start seeing the return of my shortages, my protests, my strikes, my food riots, and all that. And as the pressure mounts, the politics will just get worse. Anything can happen. It can be suffering IMA levels 2008 again, or it can be another coup, or some other form of civil unrest. It can be anything. Anything can happen as long as kunema sanctions that devalue the currency and cripple the economy. And it's guaranteed that whatever happens next in Zim, it's not going to be good. So let's talk about my sanctions. Sanctions are meant to cripple a country. That's what sanctions have done for the past 20 years. And that's what sanctions are going to continue doing for the next 20 years, as long as we keep having crazy elections. There's basically 3 types of sanctions. There's the official sanctions that the international community openly admits. These are sanctions like Zidera and the sanctions that are imposed on individual ZANU-affiliated elites. Type E Yama sanctions doesn't really matter much because these individuals who are known to appear on these lists are already mostly rich, so they don't really care much about them, and no one in the country really suffers much from those kind of sanctions. My official sanctions don't really matter, and in fact, a few have been recently lifted, but it won't make much difference. It's the other 2 types of sanctions that really devastate the Zimbabwean economy and really make ordinary Zimbabweans suffer. I'm going to classify these as semi-official sanctions and unofficial sanctions. My semi-official sanctions in the aya equity, there's nothing really on paper policy-wise. They are not technically sanctions, but rather they are conditions imposed on the Zimbabwean government when seeking for loans or international aid or any sort of foreign partnership really. The aya equity, you get told kuti, you can't get a certain loan until you do X, Y, and Z. For example, you can't get a loan until you repay the white farmers, or you can't get financial aid until you have fair elections. These kind of sanctions very much affect ordinary Zimbabweans as they generally always force the government to practice austerity measures. So basically ZANU tries to finance these imposed conditions by coming up with controversial new types of taxes to impose on ordinary citizens, which just makes life worse for everyone. But by far the worst type of sanctions is the unofficial sanctions. These are sanctions that there's nothing really on paper. There's no official condition or anything like that. These are sanctions that the international community simply doesn't want anything to do with Zimbabwe, simply because of the bad reputation Zimbabwe has developed over the years. These type of sanctions make running a business in Zimbabwe 10 times harder. They limit your choices when acquiring goods and services. It's harder to get loans. You have limited access to critical payment systems like Visa and MasterCard. You can't travel like other citizens or entrepreneurs can because your passport is weak. Your currency is devalued because no one trusts it. Inflation soars. The supply of US dollars runs out because of increased demand. My industry are dependent on international trade shut down. Business supply chains shut down. Your company shuts down or retrenches you. You lose your job. You can't pay fees for your kids. You can't get medical equipment and supplies in your hospitals. People start dying from easily curable diseases. And the list goes on. Everybody suffers. My sanctions that are really ruining Zimbabwe are the unofficial kind. Apana pa akanyorwa. They are caused by the country simply having a bad political reputation in the eyes of the international community. And they are the worst kind of sanctions. There is no way you can apply or protest to get such sanctions removed. They are simply a product of bad reputation.
The currency is freely floating.
So statements like this have become kind of a joke in Zim because the current leaders are under the impression that if they meet IMF targets, the sanctions will eventually go away. But it's just a trick, and the Western countries deep down know that life doesn't work like that. The real sanctions that make it so hard for ZANU to fix the economy must sanctions a reputation in Zimbabwean politics. That reputation is still going to be there even if you meet every single target the IMF sets. Now here's the thing, here's the problem. ZANU elites are rich. Opposition leaders are rich. People like Chamisa and BT are rich. Must sanctions do not affect the personal lives of top-level Zim politicians. They are all rich, and they generally get richer whether there's sanctions or not. Must sanctions really affect you and me, the ordinary Zimbabweans? But we ordinary Zimbabweans do not have the power to reform the image of Zimbabwe. Only the politicians have that power. But our politicians are in a stalemate, a genuine stalemate. We have had controversial elections for 20 years, and we can still keep having controversial elections for 20 more years. ZANU controls all the democratic institutions that preside over an election, and it controls the army, and it controls the police, and it controls the courts. The youngest Liberation War vets are in their late 60s, well past retirement age, but they can still very easily hold on to power for another 20 or even 30 more years, no matter how big my opposition rallies get. If you are naive and you think they can't do that, just look at the last 20 years of Zim politics. Elections have been controversial since ZANU lost its popularity in the early 2000s, but my popular opposition parties have come and gone, and ZANU is still in power. This can happen for another 20 years. It's a genuine stalemate. Opposition in a popularity but no power. ZANU has power but lost its popularity because of Mugabe-era politics. So we kind of stuck as a nation, and elections are not going to solve this problem. In fact, elections just make things worse because as things stand, they are always going to be controversial, which just means more bad reputation, which just means more sanctions. Now, the political battle between ZANU and the younger opposition parties is really a battle about liberation-era politics versus a younger generation's desire to move on from liberation-era Gandanga-style politics. There's a natural progression yaifanirwa kuitika about 13 years ago. Isina kuitika. Haina kuitika because President Mugabe changed the constitution in order to stay in power longer than the 10-year limit that's pretty much standard around the world. So, if this hadn't happened, President Mugabe would have stepped down at the end of the 80s, with ZANU's immense popularity ichiripo, and others like President Mnangagwa or Sidney Sekremai would have been presidents in the 90s and early 2000s. This would have maintained democratic values within ZANU, and things would have never gotten so bad, as there would be no sanctions destroying the economy. There likely wouldn't be any serious opposition parties in Zim today, as ZANU only had to be competent to maintain its domination at the polls. All these younger leaders that formed new opposition parties like Wanachangira, BT or Chamisa would have likely been ZANU, and would have pursued their political ambitions through ZANU, and would have become part of the next generation of ZANU leaders by the mid-2000s. Unfortunately, this is not what happened. President Mugabe stubbornly held on to power for 40 years, and the country suffered economic ruin. Those that wanted to succeed him never got the chance when they were younger. So now you have a situation whereby people that are way past retirement age are trying to restore the legacy of ZANU. But they are now old and used to their old ways. They don't have the vitality of youth on their side anymore. So new effective ideas are rare. The challenges we face now as a nation are different. They cannot be solved by the Gandanga-style politics that our ZANU elders grew up with. And everybody reaches an age you can't really change anymore, even if you want to. The spirit of Chimurenga is about fighting the battles of your generation and leaving a better future for the next generation. The Chimurenga of the 60s and 70s was about political independence against an evil, colonial, white regime. The Chimurenga of today, the Chimurenga of my generation, is about creating functional, foundational, political, and economic systems for the country. The Chimurenga of tomorrow, the next generation, will likely be about reducing the technological and economic gaps between Zimbabwe and first world countries. That will be their Chimurenga. The generation after that will have its own Chimurenga. It will have its own problems. Maybe their Chimurenga will be climate change, or maybe it will be creating a United States of Africa, or maybe it will be something else. It goes on forever. Chimurenga hachiperi. Every generation has to step up to the plate and try to fix the problems of its day. So that's the real big picture dynamic at play in Zimbabwe politically. You have this old liberation era generation still trying to fight a racial Gandanga style war with economics, which is just not possible. And you have a younger generation trying to point out that era ye Gandanga politics yakapfura, and we need a new style of politics. The whole country is extremely polarized and emotional about this generational political debate. Opposition supporters are generally younger and urban, and they are angry about the poverty they are suffering because of bad ZANU politics. ZANU supporters are generally older and rural, and they naturally feel a racial loyalty to the liberation movement that ZANU represented during their Chimurenga. So, unless we all calm down and become conscious that this is what is happening politically between the two generations, we will keep barking at each other for another 20 years and solve nothing. The suffering of ordinary Zimbabweans will simply continue. The crisis in Zim is a generational struggle about how to evolve our politics. ZANU is both literally and metaphorically our grandfathers. They are the founding fathers. We ordinary Zimbabweans and opposition leaders are the children and grandchildren of the liberation era heroes. We can all sit down and negotiate with each other. Elections are not going to solve this generational misunderstanding. ZANU has made it clear kuti hapana kwairi kuenda. Nyangoma elections akaita controversial till kingdom come. ZANU has made it extremely clear kuti havasi kuzobva through elections, which means elections will always be controversial, which means our political international reputation will always be controversial, which means sanctions will never go away, which means us ordinary citizens keep suffering. So we need kumbosiyana nazvo zvema-elections and come up with a different solution. I believe what I am going to suggest in this video is what can solve the crisis. Now let me just briefly summarize the proposal before I get into the details. All the major political players in Zimbabwe, we are going to request a meetup with ZANU and military elites. We are going to have a Lancaster-style negotiation in which ZANU elites and the generals are going to define their terms. They are in power. They are going to tell us what they want. Then after that, we are going to rewrite the constitution and create a more complex government in which our elder ZANU and military elites will retire as the highest paid monarchs of the country. This newly structured complex government will then place a younger generation of united ZANU and opposition leaders to focus on the task of rebuilding the country. As you will see from my proposal, there's a role for everyone. Party politics tombozvisa paside. We unite tombogadzirisa nyika for 10 years. So, vakuru veZANU will get to enjoy the spoils of Chimurenga chavo, while the rest of us get on with our own Chimurenga of rebuilding the country together. Everybody wins. Yes, my negotiations are never easy, but this is much easier than another 20 years of economic suffering for Zimbabweans. So, let's start getting into the details of my proposal. For sanctions to be removed, all political parties and major political players in Zimbabwe have to come to a democratic agreement. And this democratic agreement has to be seen as fair in the eyes of the international community. Usually, this is done through elections, but as I've said, elections are not the only way you're going to establish a democracy that's seen as fair. You can also have a sit down as political party leaders, then come to an agreement that way, much like the Lancaster Agreement. Now, one thing I really want to stress again about the democratic agreement route is that officially, ZANU won the controversial elections. ZANU is in power. ZANU elites vane mari dzavo. Zvinhu zvavo zviri kufaya. They are wealthy. They are powerful. They control all the major institutions in the country. And most importantly, they have an army. So they have no reason to come to the negotiation table except out of the kindness of their hearts and the spirit of Chimurenga. The only reason ZANU has to negotiate with anyone is because they also see the suffering of Zimbabweans and they also want the sanctions removed so that everybody stops suffering so much. And they also want to end the cycle of internal factionalism, coups and assassination attempts. So opposition has to come to the table knowing that they have far less power in the situation and ZANU can just choose not to care about the sanctions and walk away and deal with their own factionalism. So I need opposition leaders to come to the table with humility in their hearts for the sake of ordinary, long-suffering Zimbabweans. Now, at these negotiations, we are going to talk about 3 main topics. So I'm going to lay out a sort of philosophical framework around these 3 topics, with the idea being that I want everybody to agree and walk away from the negotiation table full of the same sense of unity and hope for a better Zimbabwe that we all had at independence. So let's begin. Point number 1, about the types of people we need in government. So we need to evolve from military type politics to a more modern style of politics. That evolution involves expanding the type of people we have in government, so we have a more complex national decision-making process. So in order to fix the problems we are facing as a country, you basically need 4 types of people in government. You need warriors, There's no shortage of warriors in Zimbabwe. ZANU is full of liberation-era warriors. Opposition is full of activists who've been fighting for better politics in Zimbabwe for over 20 years now. All these people are warriors. Warriors are generally people that use a combination of bravery and tact to defend the defenseless. The second type of people you need is street-smart people. Street-smart people are people with high social intelligence. They're able to use their social skills to build large social networks of influential people. And because of these networks, they're able to wield a lot of power and influence over others and build vast amounts of personal wealth in the process. There are three main types of street-smart people in Zim politics. There's politicians, there's entrepreneurs, and there's oligarchs. Politicians are generally people with above-average social skills and are extremely good at either talking to the public or controlling Mangoma politicians, or forming international connections with other wealthy people from other nations. Politicians come in many different flavors. Entrepreneurs are basically hustlers. These are people that are well connected with politicians and the business community and generally turn that collaboration with politicians into wealth. What's supposed to happen ideally is that entrepreneurs generate wealth for the whole society while also generating wealth for themselves. But unfortunately, we all know that's not what's happening in Zim. Zim entrepreneurs are mostly just amassing wealth for themselves and the politicians. That wealth is not spreading out to the rest of Zimbabwe. If it was, I wouldn't be making this video. But that said, you need entrepreneurs in a properly functioning government. They are an important part of a complex government. Being a entrepreneur is not an evil thing. It's necessary. It's just Kungoti. In Zim, the process has become corrupt and needs fixing. And then we have oligarchs. Oligarchs are extremely wealthy people that are so rich they can influence national politics through the sheer immensity of their personal wealth. Most Zimbabwean oligarchs are generally white. Some are black, but most are white, and they influence a lot of stuff behind the scenes. And there's not really much I can say about them because they are very private and nobody really knows how they roll. But it's important for people to understand that they play a huge role in Zim politics behind the scenes because of their economic power and street smarts. For the last 40 years, these two groups have dominated both ZANU and opposition politics. But what we now need to introduce in Zimbabwean politics is ideas and modern expertise. That's how to evolve to a more modern style of politics. For this, you need two other types of people. The first is bureaucrats and technocrats. Yes, there are some technocrats and some bureaucrats in Zim politics, but they are few, partisan, and generally powerless. A lot of bad ideas dominate Zim politics because technocrats are generally powerless against politicians. Politicians in general are not experts at anything. Most Zimbabwean politicians that have degrees from 40 years ago, from long before even the internet. Most of those degrees have no relevance to modern life. Most of them have degrees that they never even really used. They just ended up in politics and never really got any real experience in their fields. Some politicians have fake degrees, many don't even have any qualifications. And I'm sure there are plenty of 9 or 5 O levels. And I want to make something clear, I'm not trying to offend anyone. A politician is a social network builder. Politicians unite people and build networks for a common cause, so they don't have to be experts at anything. They have social intelligence. But the problem is, because of the way our system is currently set up, politicians often easily override the technical decisions technocrats make. Zim politicians often want to present themselves as knowledgeable experts when they don't really have the necessary experience. And this has led to a political culture in which actual technocrats are pretty much powerless. And because of this, the country as a whole keeps making bad decisions. Both ZANU and opposition politicians are guilty of this. And I want to be very clear who created this dysfunctional political culture. It was President Mugabe. President Mugabe was a school teacher. That was his training and that was his work experience. For most of the war, he was in prison. When he came out of prison, he had read a lot of books. And that reading that he did, yakaita kuti vave a brilliant articulator and negotiator during the liberation struggle. But after independence, Mr. Mugabe started pretending that he was all-knowing and all-powerful, that he was an expert at everything. Over the years, technocrats like Vana Simba Makoni, Vana Dr. Ushewo Kunze, and many others gave up and all left or got sidelined out of politics because President Mugabe knew everything. So this culture of politicians overriding the technical decisions of experts started in the mid-80s and it only got worse over time. And this is why technocrats in Zimbabwe are generally powerless. It's a bad political culture that led to national ruin. And it's a culture that continues nanasi, even in opposition politics. Rich politicians pretend like they know everything and make bad technical decisions that ruin life for everyone. And because they are rich, they never get to suffer the consequences of their bad decisions, which just leads to more bad decisions. President Mugabe died an extremely wealthy man. He never suffered the consequences of his bad economic decisions. It was us ordinary Zimbabweans that suffered poverty and still do so to this day. So we need to get technocrats and bureaucrats back into the right political spaces, palasiri at the complete mercy of politicians. Otherwise, poorly thought out ideas in Zimbabwean politics will never stop, and we will never truly fix our problems as a nation. Technocrats have vast amounts of knowledge and experience in very specific fields, and bureaucrats are the people that actually make sure government policies are implemented properly on the ground. Most of the problems we are facing are technical problems. Mvura, magetsi, collapsed healthcare systems, these are all technical problems. You cannot solve technical problems using military-style commands or street smarts or force. Technical problems need to be tackled by technocrats, and they need to be able to do this without interference from politicians. I really cannot stress this point enough because this is one of the biggest flaws in our current political culture. Bureaucrats are pretty straightforward. You can't be a government without day-to-day repetition of efficient daily procedures. Ma bureaucrat ndo ano interacta nevanhu on a day-to-day basis and make sure that everything is done fairly and consistently. Mazimba, just as a side note, to stress the importance of good bureaucrats, I want to point out that a good government is boring. Pauno Dilane government and things are boring and straightforward. That's a good government. You don't want things to be interesting when dealing with the government. Drama is the last thing you want. Imagine paunoenda kunotora passport or chitupa and first unofanirwa kumukira kuma 5 am or 4 am kunobata queue. Wasvika kuqueue kwacho unowana zimudhadhadha relying and you have to start bribing people to jump the queue. Then you get into an argument nevamwe vamukira before you. Then mumbotukana mumbonetsana muri outside the government offices. Then eventually wozosvika pacounter wotanga kuudzwa kuti this is the wrong document, or why this surname on this document is spelled wrong, or other stories like tina maform nasi, printer ina ink, dzoka next week. That's too much drama. Kutora passport kodita this big dramatic adventure. All that drama means kuti there's no proper bureaucrats and planning in place at those government offices. You need good bureaucrats kuti zvinhu government zvifambe smoothly. They create efficiency in governance, and it's an extremely important skill that's very complicated. So let's talk about the final group of people you need in government that are currently missing, which is academics and intellectuals. The role of academics is to keep the government informed with all the latest developments in all the different fields that make up the country. This brings innovation and competence in government, something we are sorely missing. My intellectuals are just high IQ individuals. Their role is kuti kana pane complex problems that the government is facing. It's intellectuals that can grapple with those complexities and come up with viable solutions. So let me give you a very real example of a situation that could have been solved by academics and intellectuals: the land reform program. So, white commercial farmers had a dominant share of commercial farmlands in Zimbabwe, which is obviously completely unfair. President Mugabe wanted to redistribute commercial lands to make it more fair to black Zimbabweans. But England yakaramba kubhadhara for that redistribution, and we ended up having violent land reforms. Instead of the violent land reforms that transpired, President Mugabe could have approached the academics and intellectuals of the country when it had become obvious England was refusing to pay for the farms. He could have asked them, how do we solve the situation? Academics would have gone out and done field research. How much farmland do these white people have? What portion of their farms are not being used? Which farms are profitable? Which farms are making losses? Which idle lands can be quickly revived and turned into commercial farms for new black farmers? What kind of land does the average Zimbabwean really need? There's a million things that could have been researched first so that the government was more informed about the situation. Then, after that information is collected by the academics, President Mugabe could have taken that information to the intellectuals and asked them to come up with effective solutions. The intellectuals would have studied the information and come up with creative solutions that would have avoided the violent land reforms and the sanctions that followed. For example, the intellectuals would have noticed kuti most Zimbabweans actually need modern residential houses, not commercial farms, and would have recommended kuti titange with residential land reforms first. There's plenty of unused land and plenty of building resources. Let's build houses for everyone first and make sure they have title deeds so they have assets and are financially empowered. That would have likely benefited over 90% of black Zimbabweans. Then, when it comes to commercial farmland, notice that each and every one of these possible solutions is non-destructive. All of them boost the economy without any violence or significant racial factor mentioned. Zimbabwe is 98% black, so naturally, black farmers would have benefited most from such democratic reforms. All black Zimbabweans, including the disgruntled war vets, would have all gotten a modern house within 5 years. Plenty of skilled black farmers would have also got a commercial farm within 5 years. And in the long term, over just 1 or 2 generations, white farmers would no longer have a majority ownership of commercial lands in Zimbabwe. In the meantime, they would have had to run profitable farms and pay taxes to the benefit of everyone. Otherwise, they would run the risk of losing their farms. It would have been a win-win situation for everyone. But instead of such careful, methodical, step-by-step government land reforms that would have benefited everyone, emotional racial decisions were made that led to the devastating sanctions that ruined the country. And it's now 20 years later, and not only are we still suffering, we are now also having to officially pay back those white farmers. So, to transition from Gandanga era politics to a more modern type of politics, you need all 4 of these types of people in government. Another simplified way to reimagine these 4 groups is Kuti, this is the public representative wing of government, and this is what should be the Senate. So we need to reimagine our parliament with the Senate as an idea generator and an error-correcting mechanism. This is a massive change in our politics that will bring about political stability back in Zimbabwe. In fact, shifting the burden of technical decisions away from politicians actually makes the lives of politicians a lot easier. If such a system had existed in Zimbabwe, ZANU would have never lost its popularity, both within Zimbabwe and internationally, as bad political decisions would have been rare. President Mugabe would have never been able to extend his term limits, and he would have spent the rest of his life an acclaimed global political superstar. Mr. Mugabe was extremely popular in the 80s. He was even knighted. President Mnangagwa would have likely succeeded in 20 years ago. He would have done his 2 terms, and by now there would probably be some young new ZANU president. ZANU would likely still dominate Zimbabwean politics, because there would be no reason to vote against them. With the kind of Senate I'm talking about in place, bad political decisions would have been avoided. The economy would be thriving. By now, we would probably have a better economy than South Africa, and the public wouldn't likely even care much about politics, and opposition parties would likely be very small or non-existent. The public doesn't really care much about politics when things are going well. Nobody cares. People only start caring about politics when bad decisions are constantly being made and filling their lives with suffering. That's when they start hating politicians and their political parties. Gandanga politics was very useful during wartime, but it doesn't work during peacetime, as we have all seen over the past 40 years. Peacetime is nation-building time. It's a time for good ideas, complex collaboration, for expertise, national cooperation, and kindness from those in power. Gandanga politics is a warrior's ideology. It helped ZANU win the war, but the war was 40 years ago. We need a more evolved politics to address our present-day problems. And to be fair, ZANU itself is kind of aware of this and is trying to rebrand itself. The whole idea of the Second Republic is an attempt to step away from Gandanga-style politics and not repeat the same mistakes that President Mugabe made. But like I said earlier, it's hard to change, and it's even harder when you're in your 70s and 80s. Most ZANU elites are way past retirement age, and even though they genuinely want to do things differently, that's hard to do when the economy is so bad that Chamisa has such strong popularity every time elections come around. So they resort to old controversial tactics in order to hold on to power, with the hope that they will soon turn the economy around. But with every controversial election, things just get worse, because the sanctions get worse and the negative cycle just continues. But that's what I'm here for. I'm here to suggest a way out of that vicious cycle that allows ZANU elites to hold on to the privileges and status they desire without making things worse for everyone. Alright, so let's start getting into the weeds a bit. Let's talk about the fundamental reason why things went so wrong after independence. The main reason is because the system we inherited at independence was not complex enough to solve our problems. Let me repeat. The system we inherited at independence was not complex enough to solve our problems. So what do I mean? The system we inherited was a racist colonial system, and it was a very dysfunctional system because it was only really meant to cater to a small white minority population. It worked very well for them, and they were able to build some amazing infrastructure for themselves using that system because vanga vasina kuwanda. There was only about 200,000 white people in Zimbabwe at independence. So it was easy for them to build up all those fancy neighborhoods for themselves. Those fancy neighborhoods like Madildil, Emuharare, and Kariba Dam, they had cheap labor, infinite national and colonial empire resources, and they only really had to cater to a small group of white people. Ian Smith was a dictator. His motivation was white supremacy. The system that he used to enforce that white supremacy is the system we inherited. It was the system of a dictator. That's why it was so easy for President Mugabe to manipulate the system for so long, because the system was always primed for dictatorship long before independence. There were millions of black Zimbabweans who were living in poverty and racial segregation. Funga all those millions of people vanga vachigara kumamisha or kumaghetto. At independence, they were all dreaming of getting good jobs, buying cars, and living in modern houses, zinemagetsi nemvura and all that. The system we inherited was never meant to help all those people. We inherited a system that was only meant for Dale. We inherited a system that wasn't complex enough for the scale of what needed to be done after independence. And things sort of deteriorated from there. So we have to create a far more complex national governance system in order to solve those issues, because they are still there in us. And because we need to create a bigger, more complex government, it means there is plenty of room to absorb everyone currently involved in Zim politics into that new system. So it's kind of a win-win scenario. Yekuti, you address the fundamental flaws in our political structure, and at the same time, everybody gets a seat at the table in a way that benefits and unites the entire nation. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure most of you know it. It's a basic psychological theory inongoratiza kuti you need to fulfill your lower level needs first before you can fulfill higher human desires like prosperity and a sense of fulfillment. It also applies to social organizations that evolve or change with time. And a country is a type of social organization. So it also applies to Zimbabwe as a whole. So all the political parties in Zimbabwe genuinely want to turn Zimbabwe into a middle-income country. But there's no way to address those higher economic ambitions before we have solved these basic problems for everyone. It's simply not possible. Like, for example, there's no economic policy you can adopt that's going to boost employment when most of the country is namages. Just like it's not possible to stabilize the currency when half the people in the country are destitute, living in mud huts, and are starving. Before we tackle those higher national needs that define a middle-income country, we need to tackle these basic problems first. Remember, we inherited a system that wasn't complex enough to address our problems. We need a bigger, far more complex government, and it's that complexity that will ensure all the basic needs are met for everyone within Zimbabwe. So, what exactly am I proposing? First, let me talk briefly about what most politicians really want, which is money. People need a reason to unite. People don't just unite for nothing. Politicians are people like the rest of us, and they need a genuine reason to take my proposal seriously. So let's talk about money. The economic price we have to pay as a nation to stabilize our politics is 5% of the annual national budget. Yes, I understand that's very high. That's a very high price to be just paying politicians. Most countries have 1% budget price for executive salaries. But it's Zimbabwe, and right now we all know there's a lot of corruption going on that probably even exceeds 5% of the national budget. Our national budget is about $4 billion. 5% of $4 billion is $200 million. So we divide that by 12, we have an executive budget bill of about $16 million a month. So that's the budget I'm going to be working with in this proposal. The collective executive bill will be less than $16 million a month. All right, so let's talk about that new structure. Please note, these are going to be highlights. Obviously, the negotiations will be far more detailed than this and will also include other people's opinions. Here's what the new system will look like. I'm just going to go through each of these layers one by one. We're going to rewrite the constitution, and we are going to turn Zimbabwe into a constitutional monarchy. Our current ZANU elites will become the new royals of Zimbabwe, similar to the royals of European countries. Here's what the first iteration will look like. President Mnangagwa will become the first official king of Zimbabwe, with President Chimurenga as the crown prince and official eventual successor. Other senior generals and ZANU elites will become royal governors. ZANU elites will receive the lion's share of the spoils of war. They'll become the highest paid government officials in Zimbabwe and possibly Africa, with salaries multiple times higher than any other government officials. I don't know how much money ZANU elites currently make. It's very likely they make much more money than the numbers I'm using here. I am aware of that, so just stay with me for a second. ZANU elites will never have to worry about elections again. Their new royal positions will be lifelong positions. with their benefits constitutionally guaranteed for the rest of their lives. We won't have to have controversial elections anymore. Royals will only retire when they want to. The 10 royal governors will be chosen by the king, the crown prince, and senior army generals. They'll decide for themselves. We, the general public, don't really know their internal factions. They'll get together and figure it out themselves. If they need our assistance, we'll be there to help. Whatever they decide is what we will accept. Now, on top of these high salaries, a royal fund will also be created that allows the royals to carry out any projects they want to do, either for themselves or their loved ones or for the country. Basically, this will be a cut of the entire economy in Zimbabwe. This fund will be replenished every month, and it will be entirely controlled by the royals. Right now, in my budget, in my proposal, my budget is $3 million every single month. As the economy revives, the fund will grow bigger. This royal fund will be entirely under the control of the royals. The new government will simply deposit that money in the royal fund, and that's it. There'll be no auditing it or managing it by the new government unless the royals request such an audit. Otherwise, apana, marino go deposito, they decide what they want to do with it, no one else. ZANU elites will also specify the conditions for any personal businesses that they have to negotiate to vumirana, right? In return for these accommodations for ZANU elites, Vakuru ZANU will take a step back into a more ceremonial role in Zimbabwean politics that's more appropriate for their age and stature. And they will constitutionally hand over complete executive control of the country to a new, united, younger generation to lead the country. There will be no investigations into past allegations or mistakes. Immunity from past mistakes will be constitutionally guaranteed for the royals, no matter if the allegations stem from within Zimbabwe or from foreign entities. We will all forgive each other, like we forgave Ian Smith, and we will move on. Victims of past mistakes will be compensated without any accusatory investigations, but that's an issue for another time. Now, one big difference between the royalty I'm suggesting and the European royalty is that this royalty will not be inheritable. In the deep future, I'm talking 20 or 30 years from now, when these first royals retire, their replacements will be chosen by members of the parliament and by the public. Another big difference is that to qualify as a royal, you have to be over the age of 65. You have to be retirement age. So basically, whenever these first royals finally choose to retire, the public will then get to choose who they want to be their ceremonial king. Basically, future royals will be outstanding Zimbabwean politicians or senators that reach retirement age and are rewarded with royalty after a good career in which they have done well for Zimbabwean citizens. So the royal fund will also act as an incentive for politicians to behave. Now, even though royalty will not be inheritable, we all know that right now, ZANU is trying to bring their children, their friends, and members of their tribe into politics. That's just what's happening. No reality. So, what we are going to do is we are going to reserve some parliamentary seats for the first royals. Not for future royals, just for the first royals. In the future, hopefully, nepotism and my family dynasties, tinenge tasiyana nazo. But for now, let's deal with the reality on the ground. 25 parliamentary seats will be reserved for the king, 15 parliamentary seats will be reserved for the crown prince, and the governors will each get 5 seats each. They will pick whoever they want. There will be no questions asked. This gives Hamadzao a huge advantage that the rest of us ordinary citizens can only dream of. And hopefully this satisfies the desire for ZANU elites to see their children thrive without making life horrible for everyone in Zimbabwe. So all I'm saying is a little nepotism during the negotiations is not a deal breaker. There are solutions we can suggest. Alright, so finally, there's going to be some senior ZANU politicians and generals who may be too old or too controversial to be part of the new government. So the Royal Fund will ensure that they get high salaries even in their retirement, anywhere from $3,000 a month to $10,000 a month for the rest of their lives, whether they're working or not. The Royal Fund can easily take care of that. Who those people are will just depend on what happens at the negotiation table. But obviously, we cannot have people over the age of 65 having the most senior executive positions in the new government. We need a younger generation in executive positions. So let me give a very practical example of this so that people properly understand what I'm saying. There's people in government right now who are secretly rumored to be earning hefty salaries, like my $30,000 a month. Some of these people are very controversial. Too controversial to be part of a genuinely progressive new government. Hapana munhu anofa akabvuma kubva from a $30,000 a month position to zero. Patoita ma negotiation aya, such issues can be negotiated privately. So for example, a possible private offer may be that such a person will get $10,000 a month for the rest of their lives, regardless if they get a new job elsewhere or not. The Royal Fund, Pachayo, is $3 million a month, and there's an extra provisional $1 million to juggle around that can accommodate such arrangements. That person is going to get another job or venture into a new business, or they can retire for the rest of their lives. Mari will always be there. That kind of offer is an offer someone very controversial may realistically consider. So with a bit of money, we can have fresh, efficient, non-controversial figures in the new government. Then finally, there's the issue of what will royals be doing. Each royal will basically tell us what ceremonial duties they want to do. Some royals are older. They will probably want less on their plate. Some royals are younger. They might want more active roles. It can really be anything. Younger royals may say, I want to focus on developing Kumusha Kwangu, Gandanga Kurira, and their mandate will be crafted along those lines. Some other royal may say, I just want to chill and commission big events and developments while I spend my golden years with my family. Their mandate will be crafted along those lines. Some other royal may say, I want to focus on fostering better SADC relations, and their duties will be crafted along those lines. And let's not forget, all royals probably have businesses that they run. They might just choose to focus on that. So basically, royals will individually decide what they want their roles to be. And finally, the new government will help the royals in removing any individual sanctions that have been imposed on them. In return, royals will keep a low profile in day-to-day Zim politics and international politics. They will attend the big ceremonies as royals, but they will refrain from any sort of international controversies. The goal is to try to clean up the reputation in Nika so that my sanctions are viswe. We can't do that if royals go around causing controversies or trying to give the impression that nothing has changed and they still have executive powers. There is no trickery here. If the elites accept what I am proposing, royalty will be a voluntary form of semi-retirement into a lavish, ceremonial, national role for as long as they want. There is no trickery. This is just a mutually beneficial offer. The rest of us get a genuine opportunity to begin rebuilding the country. Alright, so that's basically an outline of how the constitutional royalty will function. The last thing I want to say about this royalty arrangement though, is that I know there are opposition people whose blood is boiling right now because they feel my proposal rewards some of the corrupt behavior of the past 40 years. Those of you who feel that way, I need you to understand something. ZANU elites control the judiciary, they control the police, they control the army, they control the institutions that govern over elections. They are in power. So whatever fantasies you have about justice, take a moment to realize that they are just fantasies. Not only will your fantasies for justice never happen, we can also spend another 20 years tichingo vota nekungo tambura unless we negotiate properly. We can only prevent future corruption. We can't do anything about past mistakes. So please, opposition, think about what you want. What we all want is a properly functioning Zimbabwe. Let's bury the past and build a better future with far less corruption. That's all we can do as a new generation. All right, now let's move on to the second layer, the executive government. The executive government is the people that will actually run the country on a day-to-day basis. So first thing, once my negotiation appears and everyone is in agreement, all political parties will be temporarily suspended for 2 years as we transition to the new system. After 2 years, once the constitutional rewrite is done and the new system is in place, all political parties will be officially dissolved and we will operate as a united country during this essential economic reconstruction period. It'll probably take about 10 years. After that, if people want political parties again, the political party system can be reintroduced. Remember, stage Atiri doesn't need political parties. So the million-dollar question is, who will be president? The quick answer is no one. The position of presidency will be abolished. There will be no president of Zimbabwe. Instead, we'll have a presidential board that runs the country. Much like all successful modern corporations are run by a board, it will be known as the Presidential Council. There will be 5 seats on the Presidential Council. One of those seats will obviously be reserved for the opposition leader with the largest democratic popularity. That will likely be Chamisa, even though he has currently resigned from CCC. Chamisa is the Zimbabwean leader with the highest democratic numbers amongst opposition leaders in Zimbabwe. So obviously, Chamisa will get a seat on this board. The second seat will be reserved for ZANU elites. Vakuru ZANU will choose who they want. Are they under 60 years old and asiri on any sanctions list? We can't have sanctions removed if they're controversial names leading the new government. The third seat will be chosen by all the people who end up as public representatives in the new system. The fourth seat will be chosen by all the people who end up as senators in the new system. The fifth seat will always be reserved for a specialist in the country's main goal over the next 5 years. So, for example, right now, the main national goal is to put in this new system into place and have it work correctly for the next 5 years. So you need someone who is able to envision the system, articulate it, troubleshoot it, defend it, and all that. The fifth seat will be reserved for someone like that. But after 5 years, maybe system are in place and the reconstruction of the country will be in full effect. There'll probably be a lot of building, construction work going on. So maybe at that point, you might want to appoint someone from the construction industry into that seat, right? So the fifth seat will always be sort of like a wild card. You can go to whatever is the main goal the country is after. Muna is a specialist in that seat. So another example, maybe Mapedza construction period and it's time to launch a new currency. You might need to put in a gifted economist or a mathematician or something like that in that position. I hope you get the picture. The fifth seat will always be flexible to whatever challenges the country is facing, right? The presidential council will run the country together. They ride and die together. If they mess up and people are not happy, come election time, they all lose their jobs together and new people will be selected. This forces everyone in the council to cooperate and to always have the public in mind when deliberating. We need that sense of cooperation in our politicians if we are ever going to get anything done right in our country. These terms I'm defining, they force politicians to cooperate. Then there's the question of what exactly does the presidential council do? Here's some highlights. Articulating the vision of the government to the public. Creating a vision for the country is something that you do together as a whole parliament. But whoever is the best orator amongst the presidential board will be the public face of the presidential council and will articulate that vision to the country. So, like Chamisa is really good at this kind of stuff. He's a fantastic orator in both Shona and English. He would be good for that. So another role is defending presidential decisions in parliament and the press. Under the system I'm proposing, there's going to be a whole bunch of new faces and intellectuals in government. There's going to be 1 million different opinions and massive egos to go with those opinions. There's going to be a flood of press freedoms that haven't existed in Zimbabwe for a long time. Someone has to be the voice that keeps everything cohesive and be able to handle criticism and debates from all sorts of directions. So you need like a high IQ individual that can handle stuff like that. 3, getting sanctions removed. Sanctions will not just disappear overnight. After Tawirana in the negotiations, there's a whole international campaign that has to be done to get the sanctions removed. Whoever is the best diplomat in the presidential council will probably focus on that. I think you get the picture. The usual presidential roles will still be there, except that the council discusses everything and decides everything together. Plus, everyone has a manageable amount of presidential duties on their plate. All right, let's move on. Next is the vice presidential council. This will be 10 people, a mix of the top senators, top bureaucrats, and top public representatives. This council is not really a day-to-day council. It will just mostly exist on paper. I'm not going to spend more time on this because it's not a big part of the new government. Everyone on this council will have a full-time executive government job, so there's no need for salaries here. Next in the political hierarchy will be the Senate. The current Senate will be dissolved. All 80 present-day senators will automatically be reassigned as MPs, and the Senate will be completely reconstituted from scratch. The Senate will be the government organ that allows intellectuals, academics, technocrats, and any outstanding Zimbabwean personalities to operate in Zimbabwean politics without themselves being publicly elected politicians. 500 outstanding personalities from a wide array of different fields will be chosen to become senators. The Senate will operate as a meritocracy, meaning you will only be invited into the Senate by other senators. Because the Senate will be a self-appointed organ of government, it will have very strict term limit. You get invited into the Senate, you get 7 years to make your contribution to the country, you do your best. Once that 7 years is over, you're out forever. So let's talk about the first iteration in your Senate. Here's how the first Senate will come into place. We will pick 2 public intellectuals, 2 academics, 2 artists, 2 technocrats, and 2 entrepreneurs. Vasiri that much involved in politics, Vasiri that affiliated with either CCC or ZANU. These 10 people will then pick 5 more individuals each and then approve each other's picks. So we'll start off with those 60 individuals from completely different fields. Those 60 people will then get together and make a draft constitution of how the Senate will work. From there, after every 6 months, 100 new senators will be invited into the Senate, right? So every 6 months, 100 people. Every 6 months, 100 people. Until after about 2 years, there'll be about 500 people in the Senate. At that point, the Senate Constitution will then be formalized one last time with every senator participating. So obviously, the first people to be selected are going to be the first people to leave the Senate after 7 years. And after 6 months, the next 100 will leave and new people will be selected, and so on and so on. That'll just go on forever, with new people always being invited into the Senate. So what exactly does the Senate do? The Senate will do the heavy lifting in parliamentary debates. After all, they are the actual experts, not my MP. Talent my MP is interacting with the public and organizing them. Senators don't have to interact with the public. They will mostly be debating and discussing with each other to make sure the best technical decisions are made. Each senator will have 3 or 4 committees that he sits on. Each ministry will have a few committees that run the different facets of the ministry. Whatever problems the country is facing, these guys will come up with draft solutions, which will then be presented to Parliament for MPs to approve or improve upon. Senators are also there to advise politicians. If you have a problem as a politician, you can privately go to the Senate. Reality is complex, situations come up. The Senate is there to help politicians. Senators are also there to prevent corruption before it happens. Senators will constantly have to approve all major financial transactions at all levels of government, and they will get daily feedback on what's going on cash flow-wise in every ministry and every constituency in every level of government. Senators will also handle the majority of senior government appointments. So things like ministers, chiefs of police, army generals, and so on. The senators will do the shortlisting, the vetting processes, the public interviews, and so on. Also, when there's big screw-ups, the Senate will do the commissions of inquiry and all that. Only about 50 senators will be full-time government employees. Most senators will not be full-time employees. They will only convene whenever they are needed. This means a lot of people that are abroad can be senators, even wasingagari in Zimbabwe. Some of those people are running big multinational companies, and we need their experience, ideas, and expertise back in our politics. This way we can reverse the brain drain yakaitika over the past 40 years and turn it around to our advantage. So these people can be senators even right in England, Australia, South Africa, or wherever. Modern technology allows this, and it's not a big fuss. We just want to make sure the best ideas flourish in Zimbabwe so we can all have better lives. So that's a brief outline of the Senate. Obviously, the actual Senate will be a lot more complicated. This is just an introductory outline. Next in the hierarchy is the senior government administrators, the ministers, the generals, the Reserve Bank governors, and so on. These are the technocrats that actually run the country on a day-to-day basis, so they need salaries that can compete with private sector executive jobs. Otherwise, the best young technocrats will not be interested in politics. We need the best technocrats in government, and we need them well paid. Now let's talk about the public representative wing of government, what most of you know as MPs, which is really kind of an inaccurate phrase because everyone from this level of government down is going to be part of the parliament. What you guys think of as MPs are really residential public representatives. Of all the new governmental roles laid out in this proposal, the role of the residential public representative is the one that needs most reimagining. The main problem in our current thinking of what an MP is the misconception that the main role of an MP is to debate policies in parliament. This is a flawed conception we inherited from the Ian Smith regime. MPs are usually not experts at anything. Their main talent is communicating and organizing people. Social skills, street smarts, social intelligence. Ndokwema MP. So I've shifted this to residential public representative. So the primary role of a residential public representative is to micromanage my communities avo. Magetsi ari kufamba boere, mvura iri kufamba boere, zvikoro zviri kufamba boere, sewage iri kufamba boere, and so on. The residential public representative is the one that pays attention to the details of service delivery in his community. Vanhu vari kumusoro uku kuma executive levels, they don't know kuti sewage pipe yemustreet yako best. And as an ordinary citizen, you generally have no real contact with these people. The only person that you will have direct access to is your residential community representative. It's him or someone from his office that will contact the public works department and get the burst pipe fixed. The same applies to every other problem at this level of government that happens in your community. The residential public representative anoshandisa masimba ake granted to him by the government to get those problems solved quickly, so that iwo mvura yako nemagetsi ako nechichichi muhood mako zviri kufamba bhoo. So in a way, the residential public representative is the CEO of the community. They are the government official directly accountable to you in your community. Now I know what you guys are thinking, Kuti, that's the role of councillors, but we need to replace the councillor system, as councillors are mostly powerless. This again is mostly a product of the colonial system, and ngaisingadi kuti vanhu vatema vasave any real power. And that system just kind of got worse after independence. But just to add on to the issue here, the role of a residential public representative. Only once in a while, just once in a while, the public representative might have to go to parliament to go vote or debate an issue that directly affects his community. The public representative is still a voting member of parliament. They still get to vote on national issues. But 95% of the time, for most of the year, the public representative is supposed to be in his community, fixing problems, improving standards, interacting with the people, making sure everything is going well. So the million-dollar question now is, how many community MPs does Zimbabwe need? Zimbabwe's population is about 20 million people. Almost the whole country is in a very bad economic state. There is plenty of work to be done to assure kuti munhu wese there's a good minimum standard of living, right? There's a lot of work that has to be done. So we want each community to be small, so these residential MPs can pay attention to details and deliver good quality service. So we want each community to be no more than 10,000 people. If you assume an average family has 5 people, that's about 2,000 families. So each constituency should be about 2,000 families. Remember, the main project over the next 5 years will be building proper modern residences for every Zimbabwean with all the necessary amenities. So if we are building each of these families a half-acre suburban house, then 2,000 families is about 100 streets. 100 streets is probably about the size of Greendale or Belvedere. So that means we need to completely constitutionally reimagine what a constituency is. The country needs 2,000 constituencies, each constituency with its own residential MP. That way we can pay attention to details and make sure every Zimbabwean is getting good quality service delivery. So those of you are panicking right now, hey, Saga, does this mean we have to buy 2,000 GD6? Please calm down, right? That's not the idea here. We'll deal with that later. Let's move on. So because we need so many constituencies, it means we can absorb everyone currently involved in politics into the new system I'm suggesting. All 300 current sitting Congress members of ZANU will automatically become residential MPs. CCC will also automatically receive 300 residential MP seats. Since they currently don't have structures, it'll be up to CCC elites to decide who gets those seats. This CCC who lost seats or resigned due to the Shabangu drama will be obviously included amongst those 300. 100 seats will be reserved for all the prominent figures of smaller political parties. If you are not part of CCC or ZANU and you were a prominent figure in Zim politics in recent years, you will get a seat as a residential MP. 100 seats will be reserved for the negotiations process. There's about 250 traditional chiefs in Zimbabwe right now. So 250 residential seats will be set aside for those traditional chiefs. The remaining 800 residential seats will be opened up to the public to allow new players into Zimbabwean politics. We want to see new, younger faces in Zim politics with fresh ideas and enthusiasm. How that selection process will be done can be decided later. But obviously, it's not going to be through elections. Last thing we need during this transition process is any more crazy elections. A fair application process will be set up and people will be chosen, either by the Senate or by other MPs. Obviously, MP positions will only be for people who have actually lived in Zimbabwe over the last 5 years. We want public representatives that actually physically live in the communities that they represent and are in touch with the day-to-day struggles that their communities have faced over the past 5 years. Diasporans who want to get into Zim politics can apply for Senate positions, not public representative positions. Having smaller, more formal constituencies will also help reduce corruption because apana anomboswera achiba mari kana mvura pamba pake ichibuda iri brown. Residential MPs will be legally required to live in the communities they represent, to send their kids to their community schools, to not have private boreholes on their properties or solar installations. I don't want the same water that everybody else in the community drinks. I don't want my kids the same way everyone else in the community gets my kids. MPs will have to use the same government services that everyone else in the community uses. That way, people think twice before looting money, as their own families and neighbors will suffer if they do so. All these appointed residential MPs will be given 3 years to win over their communities. There will be no elections for 3 years. After that, we go back to community elections. There will be no term limits on MPs as long as he or she is performing well and his community loves him. Someone can be an MP their whole life. Good community leaders are hard to come by, so if you get a good one, pray they stay. All MPs will get the same salaries and all MPs will get the same community budgets, because all MPs will generally be managing the same amount of families or responsibilities. So officially, salary-wise, all MPs will officially get $4,000 a month, whether you're a rural MP or an embedded MP. But remember, each constituency will also have its own dynamic, their own rates, their own taxes. So some MPs in fancier communities might end up earning a lot more, some even $8,000 a month or more. Just depends on your dynamic with your community, how well off your community is. So just like we have residential public representatives, we will also have commercial representatives. Remember, we are also trying to revive the economy here. So we need a politician whose only job is to help Zimbabwean businesses thrive. Whether you're an established business or you're a new business, there'll be a commercial MP whose only job will be to help your business thrive. There's about 100,000 commercially registered businesses in Zimbabwe. We are going to split this up into 250 commercial constituencies across the country. Commercial MPs will be the ones who will represent the businesses in their constituencies, similar to what mayors do, but just more focused. My business is my corporate entities. My corporate entities are not like human beings. The amount of magetsi anodiwaku Lafarge cement are not the same magetsi that you need in your residential house. My levels and my business needs are completely different and far more complex. So we will create a whole new election system for commercial MPs, of which my registered businesses will be the ones voting for those MPs. It goes without saying, commercial MPs will be expected to be more educated, more experienced, more sophisticated, and more entrepreneurial than residential public representatives. All current mayors will automatically qualify as commercial MPs, but their mandates will be slightly different. The rest will be chosen after the government and the business community set up the new system. Commercial MPs will have a base salary of $6,000, but again, depending on each constituency's arrangement, richer commercial areas might end up paying their representatives a lot more through rates and taxes. Some commercial MPs may end up earning even double that amount. Right? Next, another 250 parliamentary seats will be reserved for civil society leaders. These are people with jobs like my union boss leaders, my CEOs, Emma Parastatal, any prominent internationally recognized activists, and so on. We need these civil rights kind of people to be able to easily show up in parliament and deliberate fully so that issues are thoroughly debated before becoming policy or legislation. This is the only way to ensure that truly the best ideas flourish in the country and the government is not making ill-informed decisions or policies. And then at the bottom of the parliamentary hierarchy will be 50 parliamentary seats reserved for ordinary Zimbabweans, chosen at random every month. The idea here is to slowly begin to rebuild the public's trust in government. We have had controversial politics for the past 40 years. There's a lot of people that now despise the government and don't trust anything it does. These seats are just a gesture of transparency. What happens in parliament and participate. We need to rebuild the relationship between the government and its citizen. And yes, it'll take many years to do that, but a gesture like this over time will go a long way in doing that. That's the whole idea here. All right, cool. So that's a very, very, very broad look at what the new political structure that I'm suggesting will look like. Pretty much everyone currently involved in politics will be part of the new government, plus a whole lot of new public representatives, intellectuals, and technocrats will also get to enter Zimbabwean politics. We will have a large, complex, well-structured government that is actually capable of solving the massive challenges that lie ahead. Everybody gets something out of this proposal, which gives every politician a genuine personal reason to seriously consider this and move on from our current messy politics. So, Like I said earlier, the economic price we have to pay as a nation to stabilize our politics is 5% of the national budget, which brings the total to just under $12 million a month, well below the $16 million per month I mentioned earlier. The remaining $3 million every month will go to the Royal Fund. $1 million here is for stuff that will be negotiated per negotiation table. All right, so instead of more sanctions, instead of more controversial elections, instead of more military rule, instead of more coups, instead of more violence, instead of more economic incompetence, instead of more bomb scares, instead of more factionalism, instead of more opposition failures, instead of more inflation, instead of more corruption, instead of more poverty, instead of more national dysfunction, the only price we have to pay to unite everyone and begin the healing process is 5% of the national budget. Is that not worth the end of our economic suffering as a nation? I think it is. So obviously, putting this in place will take time. It's not an overnight thing. This isn't a revolution, it's an evolution. I'm not a fan of revolutions. They often make things worse. Rino evolve through cooperation, and cooperation takes time. We will all learn how to adjust to the new system, right? It'll take time, but we will learn. ZANU elites will learn to adjust to their new age-appropriate roles as ceremonial founding fathers with genuine internationally recognized royal authority. And they will do so with an abundance of wealth, comforts, and luxury at their disposal, and the choice of whatever projects they personally want to work on. The Presidential Council will learn to operate as a national corporate executive board. Territory younger, more flexible-minded leaders. We can figure out our own chemistry and rules. Most of us, we've spent the last 20 years working in corporations. We can do this. So these 5 individuals will share the collective burden of carrying the country forward. All MPs will learn to service their communities properly with healthy budgets at their disposal. All senators will learn how to debate with each other constructively and will guide the country with their expertise and solutions into a prosperous future. All civil service leaders will have a voice in parliament so that realistic national policies are made that make their day-to-day jobs of improving the country easier. And ordinary Zimbabweans will get the chance to witness and participate in the country's politics and renew their faith in a progressive government. What I'm going to do as I start to end this video is talk about the new political culture we need to establish. I've presented a proposal for a new political hierarchy, but that's just half of the equation. Every hierarchy exists in a culture. Azvibatsiri kuita reinvent the political hierarchy without reinventing the political culture as well. So let's talk about money and primitive accumulation. This is a topic that you all better know as corruption. It's very hard to fix this culture. I hope it'll help a bit if I explain how we ended up in this situation. There is no way to sugarcoat it, so I'm just going to say it as it is. President Mugabe was an amazing liberation era war hero. He was brilliant. Just go look at the clips of young Mugabe in the 70s on YouTube. He was an amazing speaker who played a key role in uniting all the black people of Rhodesia and gave us Zimbabwe. He spent 10 years in jail to achieve this. The amount of personal suffering that liberation era heroes endured is worthy of deep admiration. And Mr. Mugabe in the 70s was legitimately one of those heroes. But situations change. Hapana munhu anoramba ari shasha forever when things change. President Mugabe was an amazing wartime hero, but his leadership in peacetime was deeply, deeply flawed. In peacetime, Mugabe allowed a culture of corruption yakaita infect everyone. Chese takashamisika when we saw Blue Roof Mansion. He kept it secret until his death. We didn't know that's how he was living while the rest of us were suffering. We've seen his kids bling on social media. We've seen the dozens of farms and mansions in Bona's divorce, Gucci Grace, mansions and commercial properties around the world. Rumors of Mugabe being a multi-billionaire on WikiLeaks. This corruption started from the top and yet spread into the whole country, and it's infected everyone. And now we are all corrupt. All of us. Everyone in Zim now participates in the corruption. We pay bribes at roadblocks. We pay money to get driver's licenses. We pay bribes to jump the line from a passport office. We cheer and envy Mambinga when they buy luxury cars with money that was meant for hospitals and Magetsi. We are all now participating in the corruption that President Mugabe allowed during his era. We're all guilty. Nobody is perfect. Mr. Mugabe was in power for 40 years. He was all-powerful, and he was the only man who had the power to stop the culture. It's a problem our founding father created, and us as a new generation, we are the ones who need to fix it. every generation has to fix the mistakes the previous generation made. So how do we fix it? Clearly, we need to solve it at government levels first. And once the government cures that element of its own internal political culture, when people see integrity and a legitimacy in government again, as the conditions in the country improve, then that new anti-corruption attitude will also spread out through the rest of Zimbabwe. So, how to do that? Here's some highlights of what we need to do to correct this culture of political corruption. First, we need to pay senior government officials decent, modern salaries. I've already talked about this. It reduces the temptation to be corrupt for most government officials who are law-abiding, rational, and do not suffer from the ills of primitive accumulation. So, the financial control of the country's purse will be split between the Senate, the senior public representatives, and the presidential board. All major expenditures being undertaken on behalf of the government have to be approved by all these three branches. An added layer of security to this will be that every branch of government and every senior executive office, except for the Presidential Council, will have a small Senate committee looking over its shoulder, with full daily access to all information of all the spending that's going on. This monitoring will be in real time, meaning corruption is stopped before the money is stolen, right? I cannot stress this enough. Before the money is stolen. Once Maria Baya Zimbabwe, so we need real-time monitoring. If a senator is suspicious, he has the power to ring the alarm bell before a transaction has taken place. So for example, the MP of Greendale will have a small committee of 2 or 3 senators he reports to that monitors his financial expenditure. Right. Third, carrots and sticks. High salaries and perks for politicians, but also very strict and very harsh punishments if convicted of serious corruption. So pursuant to the constitutional rewrite, we need to reflect harsher punishments for corruption, like what I'm showing on screen. Then blockchain technology. This, by far, will be the most powerful way to end corruption in Zim. Tikashansa blockchain technology to monitor government expenditure. It will mean we can track every single dollar the government spends. Pretty much no one will be able to steal money without being traced and caught. The technology exists, it's affordable, let's use it, and let's fix our country. Plus, blockchain technology has many other advantages besides just ending corruption. So it's worth the investment. Juma Anti-Corruption Commission is not really effective, and Marine Ngatobaya. With the right technology in place, not only will stealing be pretty much impossible, even if someone pulls it off, it will literally take minutes to figure out where the money has disappeared to. Now, I have to have a bit of an awkward conversation. I know that this kind of talk is alarming for my politicians at Kuchachura side. I know right now, this is very alarming for those kind of politicians. Let's be honest, not everybody gets into politics because they want to do good for society. A lot of politicians get into politics because they want personal power and money. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, as long as the system is complex enough to channel that greed in a direction it is beneficial for everyone, right? No one cares if a politician or tenderpreneur gets rich off tenders that are well done and makes everyone's life better. No one would care in that situation. So I am not saying politicians and tenderpreneurs can't be super rich multimillionaires or billionaires. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you have to achieve that within a functioning system. It's going to cause misery for other people, right? The motivation in a politician or a tenderpreneur, it's whether the tenders are done right or not that matters. Because when they are done bad, it affects millions of lives. A lot of people end up suffering unnecessarily. So, for those of you who are motivated by personal greed, let's talk about tenders in a way in which you can still make your money without destroying the country in the process. So, tender reforms. First of all, we need to generally remove tenders from this bottom layer of our national needs. Tenders at this level should be extremely rare, and there should be an extremely good reason for a tender, if not ever. Haisi filled yama political gains. These are necessities of life. Whatever chiripitwa in this arena should be done by government employees at the most minimal cost possible, without any markups or cuts or anything like that. We will create an electronic blockchain-based procurement quoting system in order to cut out any middleman markups and keeps costs as low as possible in this bottom layer. I know those of you who are motivated by greed will find it very hard to accept this, because I know deep down in your hearts, you believe in this life, it's each man for himself and wapusa. But these are necessities of life. Pana society yatinokwanisa kuachieva kana tisingakwanisi kuita get these basics right. It doesn't matter how rich you are going to need a hospital at some point in your life. That hospital needs mvura, it needs magetsi. It needs workers. That hospital needs ambulances so they can rush to your Rolls-Royce car crash in time to save you. The water they use at the fancy restaurant you go to, it has to be clean. You may have a private bowl at your mansion, but you need clean water whenever you leave the house. Your workers at your big company, they need clean water and magesi in their houses so they can cook and eat healthy and show up at your company fresh and eager to make money for you. Your workers can't be fighting cholera, struggling with cholera and stuff like that. I cannot stress enough with it. This bottom layer, I see a magem, right? Magem, kumsoro, not abab. Not only that, but if you're politically connected, you will make more money in a functioning government than in a dysfunctional one. Clean, legal money, much more of it. We can triple the Zimbabwean economy in 10 years, triple it. There's hospitals to build, renewable energy projects, highways, casinos, industrial parks, skyscrapers, raw material processing plants, cable companies, internet services to provide, etc. So, if you're a politician with connections to good entrepreneurs and Matenda, are well done in the eyes of the public, you are going to get more tenders because we know you do a good job. And as you'll see when I talk about economic reconstruction in part 2 of this series, there'll be plenty tenders to go around. So you can get rich and buy your luxury cars and mansions or hire jets. And as long as people are employed, the economy is booming, there's no cholera going around, no one will care about politicians getting super rich. The problem we have right now is these fancy cars are being bought and there's no mageti or equipment in hospitals for most of us. So please, for the few Zimbabweans that are well connected and are benefiting from the current system that are watching this, I beg of you to please at least consider the possibility that you may actually make more money in a properly functioning Zimbabwe. Creating a better Zimbabwe doesn't imply that you give up your fancy lifestyles. So just please consider that. We can restore the lost greatness of this country together. So I think that's it. I hope I've given everyone a good reason to unite. ZANU elites, you will be the highest paid officials getting millions of dollars every month for you to do whatever you want. Opposition party members, you are not going to vote ZANU out of power. Even if you win the election, Munongoruza still, right? You know how it is. It's been 20 years of trying. So I'm sure you know what I mean. Votes are not what you need. You already have plenty of those. What you need is to come to the negotiation table. And I hope I've given you a preliminary framework, Shandika. To the people of Zimbabwe, you also need a reason to unite. And I promise, part 2 is all about what's in this for you, the ordinary Zimbabweans. So let me give you a quick summary of what I'm going to talk about in part 2. I'm going to talk about the National Residential Housing Project. How every Zimbabwean family will get a modern house in Mvura, Nemagetsi, and plenty of food in their backyard and their kitchens. Everyone, every family, whether you are rural or urban, we need to do this housing project, not just to empower ordinary Zimbos, but because it's central to how we will properly launch a new, stable, and functional currency. This one project takes care of 4 of the 8 fundamental needs for everyone, so it's the most important project. There'll be different types of houses for all economic classes of Zimbabwe. Some that you won't have to pay anything, and the more fancier ones, you might have to pay a bit. Which house you get will just depend on economic class yako. But Shema Ghetto, Nemamadats, Chajupunza Jese, and rebuild a modern house for everyone. There's plenty of land, there's plenty of house building resources, and there's plenty of manpower for this. It's just government coordination and creativity that's needed. We are going to achieve this through a variety of government partnerships with construction industries, creative financing, and a modernized version of Mushandira Pangwe, which I will explain in the next video. I will talk about how to launch the new currency, policy gimmicks or austerity measures, a proper currency that restores proper government control over the economy. I'll talk about how to end unemployment and make sure every household will have at least one parent earning $400 a month, and how families with both parents employed can average well over $1,000 a month. Remember, you will have a modern house, schools and hospitals will be heavily subsidized, so most of this income will be disposable income. And I'll talk about how every unemployed youth can also earn at least $400 a month and also have a house by the time they're 21. The strategy that some politicians claim quickly they're going to bring investors that will hire everyone is unrealistic. Even if you make deals with 50 of the biggest companies in the world to open 50 of their biggest branches in Zimbabwe, that will still only employ about 50,000 to 100,000 people. That's a drop in an ocean. There's probably 8 million unemployed people in Zimbabwe right now. Foreign or even local individual investors are not going to employ millions of people. I will talk about how we are going to create local industries that can actually employ millions of people at the scale that's required. Right? I'll talk about those industries. I'll also talk about the quick economic changes we can expect if my politicians agree to what I'm suggesting here. Remember, 4 or 5 years. That's a bit of a wait, and one is right now. So I'll talk about how to quickly alleviate the suffering in the short term. I'll also talk about my industries that we can quickly revive so that those with proper qualifications and experience can start getting decent jobs and earning proper salaries again. I'll talk about how each of those 2,000 constituencies I mentioned in this video will each have a proper, well-subsidized school, a police station, a clinic, an orphanage, a water reservoir, a hospice, a retirement home, a library, shopping centers, fitness centers, Wi-Fi hotspots, and so on. I'll talk about that in the next video. All those little things that make day-to-day life a little easier, I'll get into it in the next video. And I'll talk about how to build community entertainment centers so that people can start having some wholesome community fun again. There's just too much economic suffering going on in the country. We need some happiness here and there in our lives. So I'll talk a bit about that cultural reconstruction that we need to do to achieve this. So part 2 is going to be the main part of the series. It's actually going to be bigger than this video. It's going to be about the actual step-by-step guide of how to turn the country around and make life for ordinary Zimbabweans normal again. So part 2 is all about you, my fellow ordinary Zimbabweans. All right, guys, please like and subscribe and share to help this video go viral, because Apanashi no Buddha unless this video goes viral. And the people that need to see it get to see it. For those of you who can afford it, please donate. I will write part 2 a lot faster if I don't have to worry too much about my day-to-day income. But in South Africa, there's a phone number you can send money to. But here abroad, there's PayPal. To the prominent figures of Zimbabwe, if you have watched this and I've managed to intrigue you and you'd like to find out more, just give me a shout. I'll obviously respond to any prominent figures or organizations that reach out to me. A significant donation is probably the fastest way to get my attention, as I will personally be calling and reaching out to thank all such donors in person and to also hear their ideas and feedback. And obviously, I am also open to criticism from the public, and I fully intend to address any criticisms, suggestions, or improvements on this proposal. I am just one person kickstarting a ball here. Obviously, the final proposal will be a collective effort, with corrections on everything that I might have got wrong, and additions on things that I might have missed. But of course, part of that collaborative effort is open discussions and debates. All right, guys, cheers. My name is Takudzwa. My friends call me Ice or TK. Dogbata in part 2. Cheers.